In 2020, Jane Reinsvold celebrated her 90th birthday. This is her story so far. Jane Reinsvold is the daughter of Harriet and Michael Tarasik. Born in Milwaukee in 1910, Harriet was one of 8 children. Harriet's parents, John and Marianna, had immigrated from Poland. John was an intelligent and curious man. He loved to read the newspapers and discuss politics with his brothers and friends. He was very proud of his children and often had Harriet read the Polish editorials so she could discuss them with her uncles. Although poor, he was always trying to enrich the minds of his children. They would take the streetcar to the museums, zoos, and all the local sites. One day in 1919, John took his 2 oldest sons and 2 of their friends fishing at a local stream. On their way home, they had to cross a railroad track. They waited for one train to pass and started to cross. They never saw the second train traveling the other direction. All 5 were killed. Harriet, who was 9, had to grow up quickly. As the oldest surviving child, she had to help her mother, Marianna, take care of the younger 5. Marianna took jobs cleaning homes and offices to support her family. They were very poor. Clothes were mended and handed down to the younger children. Cardboard was placed in shoes to give them a little extra life. Marianna's father urged her to return to Poland, but she knew her children would have a better life in America, so she persevered. One cold, wintry day, Harriet was walking home and feeling particularly sad, missing her father and brothers. A bearded gentleman was nearby and asked why she was so sad as the merry holiday of Christmas was only days away. She told him about the accident that had taken her father and brothers, and a little about how things were at home. He walked her home and saw that, indeed, the family needed some help. The next day, he arrived at their house in a horse-drawn sleigh with his daughter. They placed a Christmas tree in the corner, placed some decorations on it, and left presents for the children. Marianna came home from work and was surprised to see the children playing with all the wonderful, even if slightly used, toys. Harriet never knew who the bearded man or his daughter were, but felt that they were sent by the angels in their time of need. In 1923, Marianna married Fred Ryszkowski, but things continued to be tough for the family. Harriet was able to attend only 2 years of high school before she had to go to work in a glove factory to help support the family. In 1929, Harriet met Michael Tarasik, who was a co-worker of her stepfather, Fred. Michael was born in 1896 in an area of Poland that was part of the Russian Empire. In school, he was taught using Polish books, except when the Russian government officials visited. Then they would hide the Polish books and use the Russian books. In 1914, when he was 18 years old, his father sent him to America for a year to earn some money. After he arrived in America, he received a letter from his sister. The Russian government had confiscated the family farm and killed his parents. He never heard from his sister again. With no reason to return to Poland, he set about making a life for himself in America. He had several jobs, but eventually landed a position as a machinist at Allis-Chalmers in West Allis, Wisconsin. Alice Chalmers was a large manufacturer of farm, construction, and power plant equipment. Michael worked there until he retired at age 65. Michael worked very hard and saved enough to buy a car and a piece of land in West Allis. He had a 2-story house built for himself and his future family. He rented out the upper floor. 2 years later, he met Harriet. Michael was sure Harriet was the one for him from the start, although Harriet took some convincing. However, they were married a few months later on June 29, 1929. Michael was a very loving, attentive husband. Valentine's Day was always remembered with a traditional card and a heart-shaped box of candy. On July 16, 1930, Michael and Harriet welcomed their first child, Jane Marianne Tarasick. She was born in the house that her father had built. Money was always tight in the Tarasick household due to the Depression, but Michael had steady work at Alice Chalmers. At times, though, he only made $5 a week. Harriet got work in a dry cleaning shop when she could, while her mother Marianne helped take care of young Jane. When Jane was 7, her sister Evelyn was born. She was also delivered at home. During labor, Harriet realized that something was wrong. She could see it in the panicked expressions on the doctor and nurses' faces. They then gave her some sedation and she didn't remember the birth. As baby Evelyn grew, they realized she wasn't developing normally. After seeing several doctors, she was diagnosed with severe cerebral palsy. She was confined to a wheelchair for her whole life. She needed help feeding herself and had very labored speech that few could understand. Michael and Harriet were encouraged to put her in an institution which was customary at the time, but they kept her at home. They took her to therapy appointments and a special school for the handicapped. It was very difficult to take care of her, but her parents never complained. Harriet often said, "God never gives us more than we can handle." Even with her disabilities, Evelyn was always thinking of others. She would spend hours making drawings for others. When someone needed prayers, she would always pray the rosary for them. And she never forgot to send birthday cards to her nieces and nephews in California. Evelyn died in 1987 at the age of 50, outlasting all the early predictions of her doctors. Jane went to elementary school at St. Joseph's School in West Allis. She would often walk with her father, who would continue on to the Alice Chalmers factory. On her way home, she would enjoy walking through the alleys. The rivers of melted water around bigger mounds of snow reminded her of a map of the world. She would pretend to be a giant, jumping from one continent to another. The nuns at St. Joseph gave her a solid education and a firm foundation for her faith, which has continued through her life. Jane went to West Allis Central for high school. Going to a public school for the first time took some getting used to. Jane recalled being called upon to answer a question the first day. She sprang from her seat and stood straight and tall, just as the nuns had taught her. By the strange looks she got from the other kids, she realized that this wasn't something that was done in public school. She eventually got over her embarrassment and settled in at Central High. Jane was needed at home most days, so she didn't do a lot of extracurricular activities. She did serve on the student council and attend some football games and dances, though. Jane got a job at a dime store. She was very proud of her section, which was about 1/4 of the store. She enjoyed it so much, she would have done it for free. The 45 cents an hour was just an added bonus. One summer, she got a job as a playground supervisor. Jane felt unqualified for the job. She was supposed to organize games for the children. Jane wasn't very athletic and didn't know any games, so she mostly just handed out balls and such. Once a week, she would take some of the children on the city bus for a field trip. On one trip to a cookie factory, she noticed one boy sitting by himself. When they got to the factory, everyone got off the bus, or so she thought. Jane realized that the little boy was still on the bus as it pulled away. Jane felt she would surely lose her job. What kind of supervisor loses a child? Fortunately, Jane was eventually able to locate the boy at his grandmother's house. The boy was familiar with that bus route and made his way there on his own. When Jane was 16, her brother Michael was born. Jane graduated from Central High and attended Milwaukee State Teachers College, which later became UW-Milwaukee. Jane wanted to be a teacher of handicapped children. She always admired the patient teachers that helped her sister Evelyn. The only special education major the college offered was education of the deaf and hard of hearing, so she did that. Jane commuted to college using a combination of streetcars and buses. It took an hour each way. Her transfer point was near Jesu Church at Marquette University. She would often stop in, say a few prayers, and receive communion. She liked to start her day with God as her companion. Jane joined several service organizations, including Alpha Delta Sigma sorority. She would often go to the Eagles Ballroom with her sorority sisters or with her cousin Tess. Jane enjoyed all the big bands that came to the Eagles Ballroom, including Benny Goodman and Tommy Dorsey. At one of these dances, she was pestered by a boy from UW-Madison. Jane had her eyes on another boy, but this young man named Bob insisted upon dancing every dance with her. A week later, Bob had his friend Vern Nelson arrange a double date. That was the beginning of a 4-year romance between Jane and Bob Reinsvold. Robert Reinsvold was born May 14, 1927, on a farm near Canton, Minnesota. His father John immigrated from Norway when he was 4, and his mother Wilma was of Norwegian and Scottish descent. Bob was the middle child of 7. John and Wilma lost their farm during the Depression, and they moved to La Crosse, Wisconsin. Bob's family was very poor, but he and his 3 brothers had many adventures growing up. Bob would often tell stories of skinny dipping in the Mississippi River or muskrat hunting, including one time when he accidentally threw a spear through his own foot. Bob loved to read, so much so that as a child he read every book in the children's section of the La Crosse library. He had to get special permission to read books from the adult section. Even though he loved to learn, he wasn't a very good student. He often played hooky. He once went to the local cinema during the day to see Gone with the Wind. The truancy officer was there too, and he was caught. However, he worked hard during his senior year to get his grades up so he could attend the University of Wisconsin-Madison. During college, he worked several odd jobs to pay his tuition and room and board. Although he worked hard as a chemical engineering student, he still carried a mischievous streak. One weekend, he and his friends were bored. One of the friends was a veterinarian student and had access to the animals in the agricultural area. They managed to take a bull to the student union where a formal dance was taking place. They got the bull into the elevator and pushed it out onto the dance area on the second floor. It caused a wild panic scene. Bob and his friends scattered and were never caught. While in college, Bob got medical care for chronic ear problems he had suffered with since childhood. He underwent an operation that removed most of his middle ear. He was essentially deaf on that side for the rest of his life. When Bob met Jane at that dance in 1948, he was sure she was the one from the start. Since he had no car or money for bus fare, Bob would hitchhike the 90 miles from Madison to Milwaukee whenever he could. Bob graduated in 1951 with a degree in chemical engineering. He managed to save enough to buy a ring with a few small diamonds and proposed at Christmas in 1951. Bob and Jane were married June 28, 1952 at St. Joseph Church in West Allis. They had a morning ceremony followed by a reception that evening at a nearby hall. There was a live band that played waltzes, foxtrots, and schottisches. They had a full bar that Bob's brother Richie took full advantage of. Bob's other younger brother, Jack, had to tie Richie to a lamppost outside when it got a little out of hand. But overall, they had a wonderful wedding day. The next morning, they started their life together by attending Mass at Jesu Church in Milwaukee. They spent one night in Wisconsin Dells and another in La Crosse on their way to their first home in Fairmont, Minnesota. Bob had a job with 3M. He was initially hired as a chemical engineer, but spent most of his career as an industrial engineer or efficiency expert. Jane was initially afraid to tell her father about Bob's job. Her father, Michael, used to complain to her about how much he hated when efficiency experts came to watch him work in the factory. He felt they just slowed him down and rarely offered useful advice. In spite of this, Jane's parents loved Bob and were very proud of him. The newlyweds moved into an attic apartment in an old home. Jane took a position teaching 4th grade in a nearby farm community. Jane experienced some culture shock when she saw the rural children in jeans and overalls on the first day. Being a city girl, she was used to girls wearing dresses to school. She was very nervous as she started her teaching career. When the butterflies in her stomach continued for 3 months, she realized she was pregnant. In January 1953, Bob was transferred to another 3M plant in Wausau, Wisconsin. Since this was to be only a temporary assignment, Jane went to live with her parents in West Allis, about 90 miles away. Bob would visit on weekends. On a Saturday night, May 9, 1953, Anne Marie Reinsvold was born. During labor, Jane worried that Bob might be nervously pacing in the waiting room like all the expectant fathers in the movies, so she had a nurse check on him. The nurse came back and reported to Jane that she needn't worry. Bob had his nose in a book and was calm as could be. Bob was thrilled to be a father. He always said that he wanted 12 kids, but eventually had to settle for 9. That summer, Bob was transferred to the 3M plant in St. Paul, Minnesota. They rented an apartment for a year, and in 1954 bought their first home in White Bear Lake, Minnesota, a suburb of the Twin Cities. It was a 3-bedroom home on a large lot that they paid $12,600 for. On May 15, 1955, their first son, Robert John, was born. They barely made it to the hospital in St. Paul in time, but they did, and he was a healthy baby. In the fall of 1956, Bob became seriously ill. He had a kidney infection and had to have one of his kidneys removed. He was given penicillin to treat the infection, but had a severe allergic reaction to it. He almost died. But he pulled through, and from that time on, the couple felt like each day was a bonus gift to them. Jane would later say, "I think every young couple should have a scare like that. There would be fewer arguments and fewer divorces." During the winter of 1956, Bob began to feel ill again. He ached all over and couldn't do chores around the house like shoveling snow. He was diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis. Bob's sister Betty also had rheumatoid arthritis and had moved to Southern California. She found the warm, dry climate helped her symptoms. 3M had a position available in California, so the family moved to Whittier in early 1957. Jane had her third child, Karen Jane, on April 22, 1957. After they had settled into their new lives in California, Bob came home one day with a borrowed tent, some sleeping bags, and other camping gear. Bob's coworkers had convinced him to try camping. It was so easy and fun, they said. So they loaded up the car and drove to Zion National Park in Utah. They arrived around midnight and had to set up a tent for the first time in the dark with 3 cranky kids. After a few hours of sleep, dawn broke and soon Rob started yelling and screaming. He was being attacked by a swarm of wasps. They had placed their tent right under a large wasp nest. They quickly evacuated the site and treated Rob's many stings. But this experience didn't dissuade them. Bob and Jane continued to take their kids on camping adventures for years to come. Later that summer, Jane's parents and her siblings took the train to visit them in California. Now experienced campers, Jane and Bob took her parents camping for their first such experience. This trip went much better. They camped in Sequoia National Park. Harriet especially enjoyed watching the morning sun rays come through the mist between the tall sequoia trees. While they lived in Whittier, Bob's and Jane's family grew rapidly. Mark Andrew was born May 8, 1958. Christopher Harris was born April 19, 1959. And Thomas Michael was born December 16, 1960. They had 6 kids, all 7 and younger. When they had free time, Bob always wanted to get out and explore California and other scenic places. It was always a special treat when Jane's parents, Evelyn and Mike, would visit. Sometimes the family would visit West Allis. In 1964, the family moved to a new home in Thousand Oaks. The family continued to grow during the 7 years they lived in Thousand Oaks. Patrick Francis was born November 11, 1964. Janet Colleen was born November 11, 1967. And Joseph Michael was born April 14, 1970. They continued to explore and enjoy Southern California. 1971, Bob and Jane moved to the current house in Yorba Linda. Shortly after moving to Yorba Linda, Jane started teaching again. She got a job teaching deaf children in Compton. She continued to teach for 26 more years until she retired at age 67. The family grew exponentially in the 80s. Bob and Jane celebrated every new addition. In 1992, Jane and Bob celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary. Bob and Jane both retired, but remained active in church groups and enjoyed visiting with their now grown children and many grandchildren. By 1996, the family had spread out across the country. To help maintain the family ties, Rob, Bob and Jane's oldest son, organized the first Reinsold Tarasek family reunion. We've had them every 2 years since. Bob was only able to attend the first two. He passed in 1999. He would be proud to see how well the family has been able to stay connected. Jane continues to live a remarkable life and build upon the legacy she gained from her parents, grandparents, and husband Bob. A legacy of intellectual curiosity. A legacy of perseverance. A legacy of a strong work ethic. A legacy of adventure. A legacy of knowing how to have fun. A legacy of enjoying life's special moments. A legacy of cherishing every life. A legacy of faith. A legacy of loving family.
Now is the time, now is the best time, now is the best time of your life. Life is a prize, live every minute. Open your eyes and watch how you win it. Yesterday's memories may sparkle and gleam. Tomorrow is still but a dream. Right here and now, you've got it made. The world's forward marching and you're in the parade. Now is the time, now is the best time. Be it a time of joy or strife. There's so much to cheer for. Be glad you're here, for it's the best time of your life. Now is the time, now is the best time. Now is the best time of your life. Life is a prize, live every minute. Open your eyes and watch how you win it. Yesterday's memories may sparkle and gleam. Tomorrow is still but a dream. Right here and now, you've got it made. The world's forward marching and you're in the parade. Now is the time, now is the best time. Be it a time of joy or strife. There's so much to cheer for. Be glad you're here, for it's the best time of your life. Now is the time, now is the best time. Now is the best time of your life. Life is a prize, live every minute. Open your eyes and watch how you win it. Yesterday's memories may sparkle and gleam. Tomorrow is still but a dream. Right here and now, you've got it made. The world's forward marching and you're in the parade. Now is the time, now is the best time. Be it a time of joy or strife. There's so much to cheer for. Be glad you're here, for it's the best time of your life.